Henry Dawson stepped off the private jet with a smug smile on his face. The warm breeze of London brushed against his designer suit as he adjusted his expensive sunglasses. He wasn't just any tourist. He was rich, and he wanted everyone to know it. Henry had spent most of his life surrounded by luxury, convinced that money made him special. In his mind, rules were for ordinary people, not for someone like him. The driver waiting outside the airport opened the car door with a polite nod, but Henry didn't even acknowledge him. He slid into the back seat of the sleek black car and pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. His assistant had booked him into one of the most expensive hotels in the city, a place where only the wealthiest stayed. As the car moved through the streets of London, Henry barely looked at the historical landmarks outside. To him, they were just old buildings, nothing compared to the luxurious places he had visited before. When the car pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel, a bellboy rushed forward to open the door for him. Henry stepped out, tossing his sunglasses into his pocket. The young bellboy smiled and reached for Henry's luggage, but Henry waved him off. "Just don't drop it," he muttered, as if the boy wasn't even a person, just another part of the service meant to cater to him. The hotel staff exchanged glances, but remained silent. They had seen guests like him before, people who thought their money made them more important than others. Inside the hotel, Henry checked in without saying much. When the receptionist handed him the key card, he took it without a thank you. He was too busy checking his social media, where he had posted a picture of himself boarding the jet with the caption, "Another adventure in a new country. Let's see if London impresses me." He smirked at the flood of likes and comments from people who envied his lifestyle. Later that evening, Henry decided to explore the city. He walked into a high-end restaurant, choosing a table with the best view. When the waiter arrived, Henry barely glanced at the menu. "Just bring me whatever's the best," he said, waving his hand dismissively. The waiter hesitated but nodded, walking away. Henry had no interest in small talk with staff. He was here for his own enjoyment, nothing else. As he ate, he overheard a group of tourists at the next table excitedly discussing their plans to visit Buckingham Palace the next day. They talked about the famous royal guards who stood still, never reacting no matter what happened around them. Henry raised an eyebrow. "They don't react at all," he muttered to himself, intrigued. The idea of someone standing completely still, ignoring everything, seemed ridiculous to him. He had never met anyone who didn't respond when he spoke. People always noticed him, respected him, even feared him if necessary. A sudden thought struck him, and a grin spread across his face. What if he could make one of these guards react? What if he could prove that they weren't as disciplined as everyone said? He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the idea. It would be a challenge, something to amuse him. After dinner, Henry strolled through the streets, passing by souvenir shops and local vendors. He wasn't interested in cheap trinkets, but something caught his eye. A small shop selling art supplies. Through the window, he saw a display of bright, colorful paints. Red, blue, yellow, all bold, striking colors. He stopped, an idea forming in his mind. A slow smirk appeared on his face. Without hesitation, he stepped inside the shop. His fingers ran over the small paint cans, and he picked one up, admiring the deep red color. He didn't care about painting, but he knew this would be useful for something far more entertaining. As he walked out of the shop with the small can of paint in his bag, he chuckled to himself. Tomorrow, he would visit Buckingham Palace. Tomorrow, he would make the royal guard react. The next morning, Henry Dawson woke up in his luxurious hotel suite, stretching lazily as the sunlight streamed through the large windows. The city of London was already buzzing with life, but Henry took his time. He wasn't in a hurry. He enjoyed feeling like the world moved at his command. After a slow, expensive breakfast in the hotel's private dining hall, he finally decided to head out. Today was going to be fun. Dressed in a sharp designer jacket and polished shoes, Henry stepped outside and called for a private car. As he settled into the back seat, he tapped on his phone, checking the latest news and scrolling through social media. He smirked at the messages from his friends back home, who were all jealous of his latest trip. But what he was about to do today would make his trip truly memorable. The car pulled up near Buckingham Palace, and Henry stepped out, putting on his sunglasses as he looked around. The place was crowded with tourists, all gathered near the gates, excitedly taking pictures and chatting. But Henry wasn't interested in sightseeing like them. He had come for something else. He walked confidently toward the palace, blending into the crowd. As he got closer, he finally saw them, the famous royal guards. Dressed in their red uniforms with tall black hats, they stood completely still, their faces emotionless. They didn't react to the chatter, the cameras, or even the people making silly faces in front of them, trying to get a response. Henry watched with curiosity. It was true. These men really didn't move. For a while, he stood there, observing. People respected the guards, even if they tried to joke around. Some tourists whispered about how much training and discipline it took to remain still for hours. Others simply admired them, taking photos from a respectful distance. But Henry wasn't interested in their discipline or their history. He was only interested in proving that no one could truly ignore him. He reached into his bag and felt the small can of red paint he had bought the night before. His heart beat faster, not out of fear, but out of excitement. He had done crazy things before, but this was going to be legendary. He imagined the reaction, the guard breaking his serious face, the gasps from the crowd, the moment going viral. He would be the one to make history. Henry looked around. No one was paying special attention to him. Everyone was too busy taking pictures and admiring the palace. He took a slow step forward, positioning himself directly in front of one of the guards. The man stood still, eyes straight ahead, completely unfazed. With a smirk, Henry pulled out the paint can, gripping it tightly. He took one last look at the crowd, making sure the cameras were rolling. And then, in one quick motion, he popped open the can and tossed the bright red paint directly onto the guard's pristine uniform. For a second, there was complete silence. The red liquid splashed across the crisp fabric, dripping down the front of the guard's jacket. The contrast of the deep red against the perfect uniform was shocking. The crowd gasped, their conversations stopping instantly. People turned their heads, eyes wide with disbelief. Someone let out a small scream. A child clutched their mother's hand, looking up in confusion. Henry waited, watching the guard's face, expecting him to react, maybe to flinch, maybe to yell, maybe even to grab him. But the guard didn't move an inch. His face remained as still as a statue, his eyes locked forward, his body completely rigid. Henry's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He had imagined chaos, drama, excitement. Instead, there was only an uncomfortable, heavy silence. The energy around him shifted. He could feel it. The amusement he had expected from the crowd wasn't there. Instead, there was shock, disbelief, and then anger. Suddenly, before Henry could fully process what was happening, a group of security officers rushed toward him. Their movements were fast and precise. He barely had time to react before strong hands grabbed his arms. His expensive sunglasses slipped from his face and fell onto the pavement. The people around him weren't cheering or laughing. They were recording. Phones were pointed at him from every direction. The security team wasn't wasting any time. Henry tried to shake them off, still processing the situation, but their grip was firm. He wasn't in control anymore. The weight of what he had done was finally sinking in. This wasn't just a harmless joke. This was serious. And as he was pulled away, the reality hit him like a cold wave. For the first time in his life, Henry realized he had made a mistake. A big one. Henry Dawson felt the firm grip of the security officers as they pulled him away from the palace gates. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The bright red paint still dripped from the Royal Guard's uniform, a stark contrast against the deep silence that had fallen over the crowd. Instead of laughter and applause, he was met with shocked faces, wide eyes, and phones held high, capturing every second of his downfall. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled lightly against the guard's grasp. "Hey, get your hands off me," he snapped, his voice sharp with disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was Henry Dawson. He was rich. He was important. Things like this didn't happen to him. But the security team didn't loosen their grip. They remained professional and silent, moving him swiftly through the crowd. People stepped back as they passed, whispering among themselves. Some looked disgusted, others angry. A few shook their heads, muttering things like, "Unbelievable," and "He deserves it." Henry clenched his jaw. He still didn't fully understand why everyone was reacting this way. It was just a joke, wasn't it? Just a bit of fun. The guard hadn't even reacted. Then, a voice cut through the murmurs. "You're in big trouble, mate." Henry turned his head sharply. It was a man in his 40s, dressed casually, but his serious expression sent a chill down Henry's spine. "That's the King's Guard," the man continued, shaking his head. "You don't mess with them. You think this is funny. That's military property you just ruined. You're lucky they didn't arrest you on the spot." Henry's stomach twisted. Arrest. His mouth went dry. Before he could respond, the security officers reached a side entrance of the palace grounds. A heavy door swung open, and Henry was pulled inside. The noise of the crowd faded as the door shut behind him. The air was cooler in here, the walls stone and imposing. It didn't feel like a place he belonged. "Sit down," one of the officers instructed, pointing to a chair in the middle of the room. Henry hesitated for a second, but then sank into the chair, his confidence slipping. His clothes were still spotless, but he suddenly felt small, like a schoolboy caught in the principal's office. A different officer entered the room, holding a clipboard. He had a serious, unreadable expression, and when he looked at Henry, it was as if he was staring straight through him. "Name?" the officer asked. Henry scoffed. "Do you know who I am?" The officer didn't blink. "Name," he repeated, his voice firm. Henry exhaled sharply. "Henry Dawson." The officer wrote it down. "Nationality?" "American." The questions continued, each one making the situation feel more real. Henry tried to stay calm, but his fingers tapped nervously against the armrest of the chair. He had been in uncomfortable situations before, angry business partners, furious ex-girlfriends. But this was different. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. When the officer finished writing, he looked up and said, "You're being detained for vandalizing the uniform of a royal guard. This matter will be taken very seriously. You may be charged with property damage and public disorder. Do you understand that?" Henry's stomach dropped. "Charged, as in arrested." "Hold on," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "This is just a misunderstanding. It was a joke. I'll pay for the uniform, whatever it costs. No big deal." The officer's expression remained cold. "It's not just about money, Mr. Dawson. It's about respect. You attacked a symbol of the country." Henry swallowed hard. This wasn't just some security guard at a hotel. This wasn't a waiter he could brush off. This was serious. Then, something worse happened. One of the other officers stepped forward, holding up a phone. The screen was bright, showing a video. Henry didn't need to look closely to know what it was. It was him, tossing the paint, grinning like it was the funniest thing in the world. The video had already spread, and judging by the thousands of comments and reactions underneath, the world had already turned against him. His name was everywhere. His face was everywhere. For the first time in his life, Henry Dawson realized that money wasn't going to save him. Outside the palace, the world was already watching. Within minutes of Henry Dawson's reckless act, the internet exploded with outrage. Videos of him tossing the red paint onto the Royal Guard's uniform spread like wildfire. Social media users from all over the world flooded comment sections, expressing their shock and anger. This is beyond disrespectful. Arrogance at its finest. He deserves to face consequences. News outlets picked up the story instantly. Headlines appeared across websites and television screens. Wealthy tourist vandalizes Royal Guard's uniform, faces serious charges. Entitled man tries to humiliate British soldier, backfires instantly. Disgraceful behavior at Buckingham Palace. The internet reacts. As the videos gained millions of views, people began digging into Henry's past. His social media accounts were bombarded with furious messages. His expensive vacations, his bragging posts, his dismissive attitude, all of it fueled the public's growing resentment toward him. He had always flaunted his wealth online, treating life as if it were his personal playground. But now, that arrogance had caught up with him. Meanwhile, inside the security office, Henry sat frozen in his chair, staring at the foam screen that displayed his downfall in real time. His confidence had disappeared. His hands felt clammy. His heart raced. He had dealt with bad publicity before, small scandals, meaningless gossip. But this was different. This wasn't just a few angry comments. This was the entire world watching and judging him. He glanced at the officers standing around him. Their expressions hadn't changed. They weren't impressed by his wealth, his status, or his name. To them, he was just another man who had broken the law. He cleared his throat and forced a smile, though it felt weak. Look, I get it. I messed up. But let's be reasonable. I can fix this. I'll make a donation. I'll apologize. I'll even replace the uniform myself. Brand new, no problem. The officer holding the phone didn't react. Instead, he placed the device on the table and looked Henry in the eye. This isn't something you can buy your way out of, Mr. Dawson. Henry's stomach twisted. That wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. Just then, another officer entered the room and handed over a report. The man scanning the document sighed before looking back at Henry. The authorities are involved now. You'll be taken in for further questioning. There's a high possibility that you'll face charges for vandalism and disorderly conduct. Henry's mouth went dry. His mind raced, searching for a way out. He had always been able to escape consequences before. A phone call, a payment, a carefully worded public statement. Something had always worked. But now he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the situation only grew worse for him. Reporters had gathered, waiting for updates. Tourists were still recording, sharing their thoughts on what they had witnessed. Some even approached the royal guard he had targeted, expressing their support and respect for the soldiers' unwavering discipline. One young woman spoke into a camera, her voice firm. This man thought he could disrespect a symbol of this country and get away with it. But he forgot that honor and discipline mean more than money. People nodded in agreement. The more they talked, the more the public turned against Henry. He wasn't just a tourist anymore. He was a symbol of everything people disliked about entitlement and arrogance. At that moment, Henry's phone, confiscated by the officers, buzzed repeatedly with messages. His business partners were distancing themselves. His sponsors were reconsidering their contracts. Even his so-called friends were posting vague messages like, "Some people bring shame upon themselves." Henry wasn't just facing legal trouble. He was watching his entire reputation collapse in real time. Sitting in the cold security office, he felt something he had never truly felt before: powerless. Henry Dawson sat in the cold security office, his mind racing. His expensive clothes, his designer watch, and his high status meant nothing here. He was just another person in trouble, one who had made a terrible mistake. The officers ignored his restless movements as they prepared to transfer him. His heart pounded when he heard one of them say, "The police are on their way." The police. Henry had never been arrested before. He had always lived above the rules, using money and influence to escape trouble. But this time, things were different. His usual tricks wouldn't work. He had disrespected something sacred, something millions of people respected. Just then, the door opened and two police officers stepped inside. They were calm but firm, their eyes showing no sympathy. One of them, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, took out a notepad. "Henry Dawson, you are being taken into custody for vandalism and public disorder. You have the right to remain silent." Henry swallowed hard. His hands turned clammy as they guided him to stand. "Wait," he said quickly, trying to control his voice. "This is just a misunderstanding. I'll pay for everything. I'll issue an apology. Just tell me what you want." The officer remained expressionless. "Sir, this isn't about money. It's about respect for the law." Henry clenched his fists. He was losing control of the situation. The cameras were still outside, the world still watching. He could already imagine the headlines. "Millionaire arrested after disrespecting royal guard. Arrogant tourist learns money can't buy everything." As they led him outside, the bright sunlight hit his face. A wave of voices and camera flashes surrounded him. Journalists shouted questions. Tourists whispered, recording every moment on their phones. Some even booed. Henry lowered his head, trying to avoid the cameras, but it was useless. His downfall was being captured from every angle. One journalist called out, "Henry, do you regret what you did?" Another asked, "Do you think your money will save you this time?" He ignored them, his jaw tight. He had never felt so humiliated. They placed him in the police car, and as the door shut, he let out a shaky breath. He was no longer in control. As the car drove away, he glanced at the officer beside him. "How bad is this, really?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice wavered. The officer didn't look at him. "You'll find out soon enough." Henry leaned back, closing his eyes. He had always thought he was untouchable. But now, as the car moved through the streets of London, he realized his life would never be the same again. Henry Dawson sat in the back of the police car, his hands resting on his lap. His heart was still racing, but his mind was struggling to accept the reality of the situation. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't something he could escape with a quick payment or a few connections. Outside, London passed by, but Henry barely noticed the streets, the people, or the landmarks. His mind was stuck on what had just happened. The cameras, the crowd, the police. It all felt like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It was real. And it was getting worse by the second. When they arrived at the police station, Henry felt another wave of humiliation wash over him. As the car doors opened, more cameras flashed. Reporters had already gathered, eager to capture his downfall. "Henry Dawson, do you regret your actions?" One journalist shouted. "Do you think your reputation can survive this?" Another asked. Henry clenched his jaw, ignoring them as the officers led him inside. He had never felt so powerless before. He had always been the man in control, the one who dictated how things went. Now he was just another person being processed like any other lawbreaker. Inside, the station was cold and unfamiliar. The officers took his personal belongings, his expensive watch, his wallet, his phone. When they took his phone, he felt a sharp pang of anxiety. His entire world was inside that device. His connections, his influence, his ability to control the narrative. All of it was gone. Next came the paperwork. One officer asked him questions while another wrote everything down. Full name? Henry Dawson. Nationality? American. Occupation? Henry hesitated. Entrepreneur, he said, though it suddenly felt meaningless. Once the paperwork was done, they led him to a small holding cell. It wasn't dirty or dangerous looking, but it was still a jail cell. The door locked behind him with a loud click, and for the first time in his life, Henry was truly alone. He sat on the metal bench, running his hands through his hair. He had never imagined himself in this position. He had always thought of himself as someone who could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without consequences. But now, reality was hitting him hard. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices outside. He stood up and moved closer to the bars, trying to hear what was happening. The officers were discussing his case with someone, probably a lawyer. He let out a slow breath. Maybe this was it. Maybe his lawyer would handle everything, and he could leave soon. Maybe this nightmare would be over. But then he heard something that made his stomach drop. One of the officers said, "The embassy has been informed. He's facing serious charges, and it's not looking good for him." Henry's hands clenched into fists. Serious charges. The embassy. This was worse than he thought. He wasn't just dealing with angry tourists or bad headlines. He was now tangled in legal trouble that could affect his entire future. And then came the worst realization of all. This wasn't just about today. This one mistake could ruin everything he had built. His business deals, his partnerships, his invitations to elite events. Everything depended on his reputation. And right now, his reputation was being torn apart in front of the entire world. He sat back down, staring at the cold floor. For the first time in his life, Henry Dawson felt something he had never truly felt before. Regret. Henry Dawson sat in the cold, empty cell, his head resting against the wall. His expensive suit, once a sign of power, now felt useless. He had never imagined himself in this position, locked up, humiliated, and completely helpless. His mind raced with thoughts. His lawyer was working on his case, but the damage had already been done. The media had turned him into a villain, and the public had made up their minds. Suddenly, the heavy metal door creaked open, and a police officer stepped inside. "You have a visitor," the officer said. Henry sat up quickly, hoping it was his lawyer with good news. But when he stepped outside, his heart sank. It wasn't just his lawyer. It was also a representative from the American embassy. The representative, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, gave Henry a long, unimpressed look before speaking. "Mr. Dawson, we've been informed of your situation. I need you to understand that this is serious." Henry swallowed. Serious? It was just a joke. He protested, though even he wasn't convinced by his own words anymore. The man didn't react. "A joke? You vandalized a Royal Guards uniform in front of a crowd of witnesses. You disrespected a symbol of British heritage. Do you understand that this isn't just an embarrassment? It's a crime." Henry's stomach twisted. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time, he truly realized how deep he was in trouble. His lawyer, a well-dressed man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Henry, I need you to listen carefully. There's already talk of a court hearing. The British government is taking this matter very seriously. If convicted, you could face fines, a permanent ban from entering the UK, and possibly even jail time." Henry's body tensed. Jail time. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," the lawyer said firmly. "And let's not forget the damage to your reputation. Your sponsors are pulling away. Your business partners are reconsidering their deals, and social media is tearing you apart." Henry ran a shaky hand through his hair. He had always been in control of his image, but now it was slipping through his fingers. The embassy representative sighed. "Look, we'll do what we can, but we can't make this disappear. You need to prepare yourself for consequences." Henry felt a sharp panic rise in his chest. There has to be a way out. A donation, a public apology, something. The lawyer hesitated. "An apology might help, but it won't erase what you've done." Henry clenched his fists. He had never felt this powerless before. Money had always been his shield, his safety net, but now it meant nothing. "Think carefully, Henry," the lawyer said, "because no matter what happens next, your life will never be the same again." As the meeting ended, Henry was led back to his cell. He sat down heavily, staring at the cold, gray walls. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to lose everything. Henry Dawson sat alone in his cell, his mind numb with fear and regret. He had always believed that money and status could protect him, that no matter what he did, There would always be a way out. But now, for the first time in his life, he realized that some mistakes couldn't be undone. Hours passed, but sleep never came. His thoughts kept racing about the court case, his ruined reputation, and what awaited him outside. He imagined the world watching, shaking their heads at his downfall. The same people who once admired his wealth and lifestyle now saw him as a disgrace. The next morning, the officer returned, unlocking the cell door. "It's time," he said. Henry stood up, his legs feeling weak. He was led through the station, past other officers who barely looked at him. They had seen people like him before, entitled, reckless, thinking they were above the law. To them, he was just another person facing the consequences of his actions. In the courtroom, cameras flashed as he entered. Reporters whispered, ready to broadcast every detail of the trial. His lawyer stood beside him, looking tense but composed. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, read the charges. "Henry Dawson, you are charged with vandalism and public disorder. How do you plead?" Henry swallowed hard. "Guilty, Your Honor." A murmur went through the courtroom. His lawyer had advised him that pleading guilty and showing genuine remorse might help lessen his sentence. The judge looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Dawson, your actions showed a complete lack of respect for another country's traditions and values. This is not just about a uniform. It is about the dignity of those who serve their nation. Do you have anything to say?" Henry took a deep breath. He had spent the entire night thinking about what he would say. Now, standing before the judge, he finally spoke the words that had been stuck in his throat. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I acted without thinking, and I disrespected something that means a lot to this country. I'm ashamed of what I did, and I accept whatever punishment is given to me." The judge studied him for a moment before nodding. "Your apology is noted, but actions have consequences." Henry braced himself. "You are sentenced to a fine of £50,000, community service of 200 hours, and a 5-year ban from entering the United Kingdom." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some believed he got off easy, while others thought the punishment was fair. Henry barely heard any of it. His entire body felt numb. A ban from the UK. He had always traveled freely, attending exclusive events and meetings in London. Now, that door was closed forever. Community service. He had never done a day of hard work in his life. A massive fine. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it represented. A public reminder that his wealth couldn't buy his way out of everything. As he was led out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. "Henry, do you regret your actions?" This time, he didn't ignore them. He stopped, looked at the cameras, and nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." Months later, Henry's life was completely different. His business deals had suffered, his social media following had dropped, and his name was permanently tied to his biggest mistake. He completed his community service, cleaning public spaces and helping charities, work he had once thought beneath him. For the first time in his life, he understood the value of humility and respect. The world had moved on, but Henry knew one thing: he would never be the same person again.